and understand it to survive and analyze your problems without being blind, without being blind.
Talking to my carcass and how I should have done a harvest.
All right, everybody. Well, welcome to the Ascend Your podcast with me and, of course, your favorite person, Ryan Henry.
Hello.
Today we have a very special guest joining us. We have Dr. Jay Carney joining us today. Very dear friend of mine. We go way back. We'll be interviewing him on his latest book. So we're very excited to have him here. How are you doing, Dr. Carney?
I'm doing well, Julian. It's great to be with you and Ryan, and thanks for this opportunity to talk with you all today.
So we're going to jump right into it, Dr. Carney. Can you talk a little bit about yourself to the audience out there?
Sure. Right. So, again, Julian and our connection is actually through my employer here. I work here. I teach theology and African studies here at Creighton University, which is a Jesuit Catholic university in Omaha, Nebraska, here in the middle of the USA. And I've been here for nearly a decade now, coming on it. I teach general classes in theology, church history, African studies, but also in my research is primarily focused on particularly the Catholic tradition in political and historical context in East Africa, especially Rwanda and Uganda, where I've also spent some time doing research and also living with my family, most recently for a year in Uganda. So I'm married, I have 4 children, and also thanks to Julian, I've developed a real appreciation for Kendrick Lamar. So
I knew you were going to bring that up. I love it.
He's a Pulitzer Prize winner now, I believe. So
he is.
Yeah. So
Not expect that.
I know. I bought him to, Good Kid, Mad City, and he listened to it. So shout out to Dr. Carney.
There's a lot going on there. Might have to get it out right now. So that could be in the background of our interview.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Hey, that's solidarity on the streets right there. Okay, so.
Wow, you got the greatest plugs, I swear. There's no competing with you. So before we get into like the interview questions, can you just give the audience just a short synopsis of your book, your latest book?
Sure. So the book's title is For God and My Country, Catholic Leadership in Modern Uganda. For God and My Country is not, as my wife thought, the motto of the U.S. Marine Corps, but rather is taken from the national motto of Uganda. So it'd be similar to what Americans would see, like, in God we trust. They might see that on their currency. So across, not just Catholics and not even just religious people, but there's sort of a broader motto. But in the Catholic tradition, it's been quite common since independence for leaders in the church, whenever they issue a formal statement, to also end it with the line, for God and my country. So, and the book kind of took its starting point there, which is broadly looking at the church's public role in society. And so not necessarily the classic case of church and state in an institutional way, but rather looking at how have Catholic leaders engaged the social, public, political sphere from a perspective of their Catholic faith and their social ethics, but also in a way that's broadly served the common good. So it kind of turned into a multi-biography of 7 different leaders spread throughout the country and also historically going back to the 1960s up to today. And I've tried to draw out what I see as constructive lessons particularly for religious leadership in the public sphere that, hopefully others could benefit from.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ryan and I were just talking about, like, we definitely learned a lot, and, East African history is not taught in our schools very, very often, let's say. So it was also a very good history lesson as well.
Yes.
So for the listeners out there, we'll start off with it right off the bat. Out of all the case studies that you did, there's 6 that you focused on, including the one in the introduction. Who in your mind was, like, to you, most influential, most impactful, or maybe the most fun writing, something along those lines? Like,
Do you
yeah.
mean on me personally or on
Yeah.
Uganda?
Well, both maybe.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I'll start with Uganda. Because I was thinking about that question. It's a good one, and I probably Father John Mary Waliggo. I think, I mean, a guy who was like the James Madison of Uganda. I mean, he literally fathered the Constitution, and I think had a tremendous impact through that, both through writing the Constitution, but also through his radio call-in show that he did actually with a Muslim colleague for many years. And really just in my interviews, just a lot of influence both within the church and in broader public life. He also headed up the Human Rights Division for the Ugandan government up until his death in 2008. So probably Waliggo, I think on a public way, I'd have to point to. On a personal level, I think the one that probably when I read it, and this sounds kind of, because I wrote the book, but I remember when I was rereading it near the end, I kind of teared up some, was Sister Rose Muyenza. And I think just her work with kids on the streets and just really desperate situations where, young people are really on the edge. Their lives can go one way or the other. And often she sort of was the bridge to something much better. And I think just the generosity of her heart, the way people would talk about her as a kind of adoptive mother and aunt, and just really, to me, embodying the love of Christ in a social way. So I think she, on a personal level, I think had a real big impact on me. So
I probably have to go with Sister Rose too. I'm looking at my notes on her. Like, yeah, I think that was probably up there.
Yeah, the Mother Teresa of Uganda, as she was described to me several times. So
yeah, my favorite part was like she actually took in young women and helped them start their own businesses.
That's right.
That is pretty cool to me. And then not just the poor, but like every part of society that was marginalized, whether it be like disease or sexual or anything that had you marginalized. She had no care in the world. You're a human being to her.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to me was also a big takeaway from her, because I knew she had done a lot of work with the poor, but this phrase I use in the book, the working with the people without people, that really stayed with me. And because it really is a more capacious idea. For sure, she worked with the materially destitute, but as you noted, whether it was victims of sexual abuse or the abandoned children of clergy or people with drug addictions or even wealthy kids who flunked out of school and had no way forward. And just this, in East Africa, relationship is so important. And if you're cut out from your family and those broader social ties, you really are alone. And that's in many ways even worse than being poor. And so to me, she really tried to recreate these networks and the social bondedness among folks who maybe had been left out in the margins. So yeah, I think you're right that she had a capacious sense of that. And I think that's something that Christians and other people of goodwill around the world could really learn from. So
Exactly.
No, absolutely. So kind of more generally speaking, do you see, like, there's, to me, reading the book, I was really like, there's a very clear, not a clear, but there's a distinction between how Catholic social teaching is viewed in Uganda and say many of the major denominations in the United States. Like, from writing the book, do you see any major differences between Ugandan social teaching and the major denominations in the States? Or is that kind of a too broad of a generalization?
No, it's a good question. I mean, the principles of Catholic social thought would be global, right? And so to a degree it would be shared. I just think partly because of the social deprivation many people are facing in Uganda, as well as the church's major public role in life, I just think it resonates more, and you see people much more out in the open. I think in America, when we think of religious people in public life, we think of, I don't know, the moral majority or the religious right. And I know at least progressive friends of mine get all nervous, like, what do you, I don't want those religious people get, like maybe Martin Luther King's okay, but and I think also America has this kind of inbuilt sense of separation of church and state. And of course, the churches here, both Catholic, Protestant, everywhere, I mean, they do a lot of social work. So it's not to say that that's not happening, but I do think in Uganda, there's just the role of religion in public life is bigger, and therefore also leaders themselves, I think, are much more influential. And even a regular priest is going to have a much bigger social role in the community and providing for people. I mean, I remember the first time I lived in Uganda when I was a student, and the priest I worked with, I think, Julian, you might have met him once, Father Joe Kokoza.
He visited me when I had malaria.
You out with malaria.
Yeah.
And he's a really good guy, you know, right? Not every priest is, you know, a great guy, right? But he, you know, when I first lived with him, I mean, remember all these women and others were lined up at the church. I said, you know, where are they going? He said, well, they need a ride to the bank, and we're trying to start bank accounts for them. And so we're getting micro loans. And I was like, so all these people get in the back of his pickup truck, and then they go down the road. And, you know, and I just don't, you know, in my church in Omaha, I'm not expecting, you know, the priest to be transporting people down to First National. So, you know, there's just a much bigger role for religious leaders. And I think, you know, so what I try to do in the book then is, by no means is this exclusive, but these might be exemplars who might even stand out at a national level. But this is, you know, this is happening all over the society. So.
It's kind of along the lines of what me and Julian were talking about the other day. I kind of feel like maybe we don't have as big of a appreciation for Catholic Church or any church as a society as a whole in the US. Maybe because we aren't as reliant or affected
Right.
as people in Uganda are. I mean, we have food banks and, you know, different drives and stuff, but I feel like churches there have like a huge impact, whether it be education, family structure, like very big impacts.
Right.
That's why maybe I feel people in Uganda might have a better view of the Catholic Church and your general person in America.
Right.
When you hear Catholic Church here, you think of sexual scandal.
Yeah, right. No, and I think you point to in addition to what I said earlier, you mentioned schools. I mean, healthcare systems and hospitals, or again, that's common globally, but I think in Uganda, it's all the best hospitals are also often run by the churches as well. So it's a question not just also of quantity, but also quality.
Right.
Schools you mentioned. I already mentioned the role of parishes. I also think in general, Ugandans and Africans more broadly just have a deep spirituality. And so the kind of secularism that's even for religious people in the West, the world we live in is broadly secular. I mean, and that's not all bad. I mean, there are good things to understanding germ theory and, you know, recognizing the way things work in a scientific way, but at times it can cut us off, I think, from deeper dimensions of reality. And I think in Africa, there's just that awareness is very present to people. And therefore, I think also it's more natural for religious leaders to be in the public sphere because people have an inbuilt sense of the value of spirituality. And, you know, you mentioned, of course, I think the Catholic Church, particularly in the West, has struggled with, and it's a needed, I mean, not wholly unlike what happened in whether it was the Crusades or the Inquisition or other things, but I mean, we're dealing with the fallout of a terrible crisis and scandal, and that needs to happen. It's much better for the church to be dealing with a scandal than for kids to be sexually abused, right? So and unfortunately, I think this stuff happens all over the world, so I don't think it's exclusive to us, but I do think we have to, I say that as a Catholic, you know, work through this and be more honest and authentic. And I think Pope Francis has showed that you can be honest and upfront and put things out there and not hide it. And you can still have some credibility, but you've got to be honest and you've got to clean things up and you have to be really repentant and try to make sure you don't commit the same sins you have before. So.
Absolutely. And I'm gonna bring it back to, I'm gonna mispronounce this name, so I apologize. To your section about Rose Muyenza. And it was my favorite part in the book, being from Chicago, that whole solidarity on the streets.
Right.
And I guess, could you speak to on two things, like what that meant in Uganda, and like could we take that and implement that in, I just could see that working in like places like Chicago,
Yeah.
Detroit. Like, can you talk about what that was, solidarity on the streets, and do you
Sure.
think that could be used in America?
Right. Yeah, so the term solidarity is a classic term in Catholic social thought, which is the notion that one needs to be in relationship with those who are suffering, but also take direct action to try to alleviate the root causes and symptoms of their suffering as well. So to move to the people, or as I sometimes joke with my students, I go beyond just, giving a little contribution on Instagram or doing something else, to actually move to people. And I think the idea of streets, as you could tell, I was trying to build in a couple different ways. Streets in a
I
literal.
loved your language in it.
Yeah, right. I knew you'd appreciate when I quoted the Urban Dictionary.
Yeah, I loved it. I was like, yes, that's the Kendrick Lamar in him now.
That's right. Yeah. So, you have obviously the literal sense of kind of deprivation, but also I think the sense of street is that you have to think creatively. You need to get outside the box and recognizing the ingenuity of people who are on the streets and meeting people where they are. And I think what part of Sister Rosa's gift was this ability to actually think, like imagine a different kind of future, and not just doing charitable work the same way it had always been done, but to say, no, I have to go to where the people are. We need to really, so locating yourself right in the heart of Kampala, and we need to open this up even to people who might be, as we talked about earlier, socially stigmatized. Even naming the group the Daughters of Charity. And then interestingly, when the boys would join the group, they're also part of the Daughters of Charity. I found that. And Uganda, like a lot of African cultures, has a lot of patriarchy in it, but I thought it quite interesting that, because usually, you have masculine language and then the girls join that. In this case, everybody becomes part of the Daughters of Charity. So there's sort of subtle ways that I think, you build also different kinds of relationships and communities. And again, for sure, there are people in the States doing, I look at someone like Dorothy Day, the late Dorothy Day, who did so much work with the Catholic Worker in New York. And again, was also, I think, a visionary in seeing a different way to do a social apostolate. But I do worry sometimes that folks are there, but I think in the contemporary situation, I think a lot of Catholic churches, the model can be very much a membership model. So you take care of your people and the people who belong to your church. But I think what Sister Rose and all these leaders show us is that a genuine religious leader needs to be, as Cardinal Nsubuga would say, a shepherd for all people, right? I'm serving not just my members or the people giving donations to me, but everybody in my geographic area. And I think that's where, but again, to me, Sister Rose is also a reminder that these initiatives don't always come from bishops or from priests or from the kind of professors like me, but often it's, she had to leave her religious community to actually do this. And so I think it's another reminder to not allow institutions to stop you if you feel like you have a call and vocation to be willing to live that out, and of course she had to do a lot of fundraising and other things, but to me, she also had a certain courage and creativity in how she lived out her mission on the streets. So,
going off of that, it speaks, there are a lot of Catholic institutions that do a lot of great work in the inner cities. I think of like the first time I read Tattoos on the Heart.
Right.
About the
work in LA.
Yeah, just amazing work. And it kind of reflects how she was operating, like that way, the way you approach communities and that creative action, like where you're using the creativity of the people in these situations as an advantage. And it's just really inspiring. There's this, I'm so like, I hate to blow smoke up your butt, but it was a lot of inspiring stuff to read in this book.
Yeah. No, me too. I mean, and I don't say like, yeah, it was awesome, I wrote it, but I mean, it was really a privilege to write the book because I felt, when I say privilege, just to be able to share the stories of these folks. And, and obviously the way I frame it or craft it might be a little bit unique to me, but I just think, the stories are well known in Uganda, but are worthy of a broader audience. And even sometimes in Uganda, just to let people know about some of these great heroes. And again, I try to be not just hagiographic. I mean, I think there always are, nobody's perfect. And I think that can be a danger. We sort of can, going back to Dorothy Day, somebody asked her before she died, Dorothy, do you think they'll make you a saint after you die? And she said, well, God, I hope not. Then they'll forget everything I ever did or said, and they'll turn me into a statue, or something along right. So I think it can be and so that, again, some of the critiques and things I raise is not to just bash people, but just to say, that there's also things we can learn, like with Sister Rose, for example. I mean, a wonderful person, but probably overextended herself, right? And a
Right.
little bit of a micromanager, in some ways just exhausted herself. And I think that's a healthy lesson for anybody doing community work. You got to figure out ways to sustain, and that's not always easy when you're really passionate about something. So
yeah, it seems that all the leaders of the they're wearing multiple hats, like literally every hat you can think of. There's like a quote in the book I remember that I forget which person it was, but I didn't even think that he or she was a priest, or I didn't even think he was
right.
like, because they have wearing so many different hats. It's
Yeah.
really crazy to think about, because as you were saying, in the States, we view anybody with the church, if they were to take, let's say, involved politically, that we would view that quite negatively.
Right.
Not, but the majority, because we have this ingrained separation of church and state in any community, any religious community.
Yeah.
So
I'm curious. I don't want to go off down a rabbit's hole, but I'm curious if there'll be any reaction to Raphael Warnock, who's running for Senate in Georgia, because he's actually the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist, which was Martin Luther King's home church. But he's a Democrat. So I'm curious though, whether this, because obviously these Senate races will be really closely watched with the control of Congress on the line. And if anyone will raise the concern, like a minister running for the Senate, is that a problem? Or the fact that he's more politically progressive and coming out of the Black church, if that will kind of reduce the tension, at least amongst some who might normally criticize that. But again, it's just an interesting, maybe comparison.
It's a been mixed on the Democrat side, because, there's a party that wants religion taken out of politics. It would be the left.
Right.
I would hope both, but more so the left, I feel. You all in Georgia, the churches down there, it's community right there.
Right.
So
right.
that could also, I think, be a great positive for him.
Right.
It was up north in the Midwest, I think he'd be in trouble.
Yeah. Right.
So I'm going to mispronounce his name as well. So you mentioned him briefly, Emmanuel Nsubuga, and it was about this Sheperd type ministry, Sheperd for all. And you see in a lot of, I hate to generalize Africa because it's a continent.
Sure. Good, Julian. You got the first question. I'm proud of you as a Creighton grad for no.
Well, it's true though, because especially with post-colonialism in the continent of Africa, you see tribal and interreligious conflict, post-colonialism really exacerbated due to the nature of nationalism, things like that.
Right.
So it seems that Nsubuga was really influential, because you saw that he was working with if I'm remembering correctly, he's working with a lot of other religious communities as well.
That's right.
And to try to bridge that gap. So can you talk a little bit about that Sheperd ministry that he was really big on, and like what lessons we can take away from him?
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I borrow the image of shepherds, obviously a major biblical image, both for God and for Jesus Christ. So that has a deep heritage in the Christian tradition. But it was also a term that Nsubuga himself used to describe his ministry. And in his first public homily, really speech, he said, I'll be a shepherd not just for Catholics, but for you all. And I think he did. I mean, he was a Buganda, and Buganda is the biggest kingdom or province in Uganda. And definitely, I think it was seen in that way and probably had more influence within that region than some other parts of the country. But having said that, he worked very hard, especially in Buganda, to bridge some of the religious divisions that had been very divisive in Uganda's history. Because, as you might have seen, maybe when Ryan was getting overwhelmed, some of that early history, you
Yeah,
see
same.
there really was a lot of religious conflict. And I mean, an out and out conflict with the war in the 1890s, and then tension under colonialism. And so, when Nsubuga became an archbishop in 1966, it was only several years after independence. And, these lines had also become very politicized, where, the Catholics basically had their own political party, the Anglicans in many ways had their own, the Muslims had their own movement. So steps he took, such as going to a mosque, right, or going and preaching a homily in the Anglican cathedral. I mean, these are significant symbolic steps. Collaborating with leaders such as Janani Luwum, the famous Anglican martyr who Idi Amin killed, or with later Anglican, Protestant, and other Muslim leaders to speak out against the abuses of Obote's regime in the 1980s. I mean, I think these were all ways of trying to bring people together, again, recognizing we don't all agree on all questions of doctrine. Obviously, our histories may be different, but when it comes to basic questions of defending the common people against authoritarianism, or trying to just emphasize what holds us together in a shared worship of God, that these things can hold us together, even though we might still recognize the differences. And I think Nsubuga's manner, I mean, from what I learned interviewing people, was just, he had a kind of joy with people. He just enjoyed being around people, no matter what background they came from. And I think that personal style also came off, just like, again, similar to Pope Francis. I mean, his statements make an impact, but a lot of what I think shapes people is just how Pope Francis comports himself, and this idea that he doesn't try to stand above people. He's down to earth, he's humble. All of those are important lessons for leaders, that it's not just what you say, but how you comport yourself, how you live your life. That's what people really remember.
So many election jokes just going through my head.
That's your one.
No, let's keep it on.
Uganda has its share of stolen elections. There have been several times the last few weeks where I'm glad that we have a decentralized political system where the same party or government's not counting everything.
Oh, man.
Yeah, elections really matter, and you really want that to be a pretty sacred process in terms of the rule of law. So.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, before we go down that rabbit hole and forget, I'll ruin this name too. Nsubuga, right?
It's actually Nsubuga.
Okay, I'm just gonna stick with how I
pronounced it in.
He ruins a name every podcast.
All
right, Emmanuel.
Tolerant people.
That's was he the one that said, oh great, now I lost my train of thought. All right, skip it. Lost it. I'll be back in a minute and I'll cut some off.
All right, well, we got about 15 minutes. So I'm going to mispronounce this, but the rate, is it radio pacis?
Yeah,
pacis?
The Latin word for peace.
Oh, I did not know that. Radio peace, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, right.
So radio pacis.
Yeah, good.
There you go. Radio pacis. I actually had heard about them a little bit when I was in Uganda.
Okay.
I think maybe because you might have mentioned them to me, but it spoke volumes to me about the impact it had on the social transformation in many communities, and how I mean, the people that started it were like no experience in media whatsoever, and then it turns into a 10 million people
Right.
listening. And not only did they focus on urban communities, but they really went out of their way to get some of those rural communities that, let's say, that aren't normally impacted by radio and media.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about Radio Pachis and like some lessons that radio in the States, like even broadly speaking, can take, or us as a podcast or religion?
Hey, we have like 10 viewers. So I'd like to get to 1 million.
You just need to add a few zeros, and then and then you'll catch up to them. Yeah. Well, I would say, yeah. I mean, in addition to Sister Rose, the radio podcast case to me also was, I just found fascinating, and it was not one I knew about. In fact, I was connected to them through a relative of my wife who had worked up in that area as a Camboni missionary for many years. But when I started the project, I knew nothing about them, but it was just a fascinating case of using media to both proclaim the church's mission in a kind of explicitly religious way, but to also simultaneously do all of this social outreach and everything, as you read about, from empowering refugees and giving refugees literally a show to talk on, to going to local communities that need a bridge built or water, and doing community forums where they can talk directly to their political leaders. And so it was interesting interviewing the founders. I mean, I could tell this is, again, I think maybe one of the important lessons from Catholic social thought is the way in which it needs to be embodied, right? And so both these leaders are shaped by these ideas, but then the creativity comes in how do they actually put it into practice, and the way in which they are able, I think I wrote in the book that their highest listenership is in Yumbe, which is a predominantly Muslim community, because people want truthful radio, right? I mean, we live all over the world in an era of fake news and politicization and commercial manipulation, and so people all over the world want to know what's legit. And so I think Pachis is a good example of doing best practices, learning from the best people, holding people accountable to a high standard. And yet still, I think sometimes in the States, there can be a sense like, well, if you do that, you somehow can't be religious anymore. You got to let go of that. It's like, no, like they're still doing their mass and their rosary, and they're still, I mean, they haven't lost their mission. It's just, but you can do both. And so that would, again, to your other question, I mean, that would be my message in the Western context is, let the radio really engage the community. I mean, if you're running a Catholic radio station in Omaha, be in Omaha, engage the place, and don't just engage Trump and the people who hate him, or some national cultural wars stuff that's going on. And I do think sometimes the Catholic Church in the US, I mean, one, in the media world, it can trend, so conservative that some of the areas of Catholic social thought that I think really matter to people are not even talked about. But then within that, there can sometimes just be a disconnect from, I think, the lived reality of what's going on. And honestly, I think, radio really matters, especially in rural Africa. That's changing a little bit with smartphones, but still, radio matters in a way that it doesn't in the US anymore. But I do think podcasts, like what you're doing, are really making a comeback. And of course, there are religious media groups that are on that wave. But I think one of the challenges of the whole podcast world, and you guys could say more about it, is just it's like a hose of information. There are so many. And so I think one thing Radio Pachis has going for it is a kind of strong reputation and not a monopoly, but there's just not 10,000 different voices that are trying to compete. And I do think that's a challenge in modern media, is just, you could be trying to get the right message out there, but you're just one voice among, so many. But again, again, just to go back to your point, I think they are an inspiring example of trying to use media to reach people, but also to sort of improve their lives and improve their human flourishing. And my sense is that's a message that a lot of people can get on board with.
Ryan, did you remember your question?
No, I gave up on that.
all right. I once, when I was in graduate school, I had a course with this really famous professor who had taught for years and years. A guy named Stanley Hauerwas, who's kind of well known in social ethics. But I remember this other professor said, you know, Stanley Hauerwas has forgotten more stuff than you've learned.
Wow, that's a great quote.
And at the time I was slightly insulted, but you know, the older I get, the more I'm like, yeah, you know, I mean, it's no insult, but like I've tried to help my high school kid with college algebra. I mean, I used to know this stuff well, and it's like, I don't know what. I don't remember any of the algebra I learned 30 years ago or whatever.
I'm gonna have to remember that. That one hits home. Easily, I have forgotten more than I learned.
It is as a badge of honor, not just as an embarrassment. You're like, I got so much in my head, man.
I'm gonna start going that route.
To keep it. Oh, one question you guys had on, I thought the whole issue of martyrdom with Kiwanuka.
Literally, the guy to think of my question for. Do you think, I definitely saw the pros and cons of him kind of playing politics, but he seemed more of a country before politics kind of person, right?
This is Kiwanuka?
Yes.
Yeah, right. No.
If I'm remembering right, he kind of played, who were the two leaders? Amin and Adoki.
Yeah.
He kind of played a little bit of politics he was first with Adoki and then he went with Amin, right? And then he went with Adoki.
Yeah, Bote. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna butcher that name.
Yeah, so Kiwanuka himself, you know, as you read, was one of the early political leaders during the independence period, and he was the leader of the Democratic Party, which is no direct relationship to the U.S. Democratic Party, but it took its title from the idea of trying to empower the people, but it was predominantly, especially in its early years, made up of Roman Catholics who had been largely marginalized politically during the colonial era, because the British in general favored more the Anglicans, and as I said earlier, there were these various political religious tensions. So in some ways, not wholly unlike Northern Ireland, it was sort of an empowerment movement to try to enable Catholics to have a voice at the table. But I think where Kiwanuka made a good move and is a good lesson, I mean, he didn't lose that. And as you could tell, he was a devout Catholic himself. But he tried to broaden the party as well to include, you know, Anglicans and Muslims, and to not become what's called a sectarian party, which means that the party is just about furthering the religious interest of your church or your religious group. And that accusation was thrown at him a lot, but I think it was actually used in a polemical way or in a kind of propaganda way. I think at his core, Kiwanuka was a kind of small L liberal Democrat. I mean, in terms of really seeing the broader common good and really aware of the danger of a kind of religious sectarianism or even ethnic sectarianism. And so, you know, he was from Buganda in the South, but his party had branches all over the country and were very much a national party. He was, you know, as you read about, was the last leader in Uganda to lose an election and step aside. As we're seeing in the U.S., apparently is not the easiest thing to do. You know,
I always thought it was the norm until
you gotta go. You gotta, you know, you shake your hands, and you know, maybe I should send my book to President Trump and tell him to read chapter 1. All right, but in any case, you know, so he spent a lot of his time in opposition. He was a very principled guy, and as I write about it, maybe some have criticized him for being almost so principled that he didn't make compromises at times, or could be a little bit arrogant at times about talking down to people. But I think, you know, when I look back on him, to me, he's a real example of, yeah, these ideas of truth and justice, you know, that was the motto of the party, and not, those aren't just slogans. It's not just a bumper sticker, but to actually try to live out and lead a politics of truth and justice, and particularly against political lies and propaganda. And in that sense, I mean, I do, on the question of whether he's a martyr, I mean, I actually do, I would say so. I mean, I think there is a place for people who give their lives for the common good. I mean, he's not killed, quote unquote, because he's a Roman Catholic who goes to mass, but I do think he was killed because he wouldn't compromise the rule of law and judicial independence. And I mean, God knows those issues are really big, right? All over the world. And I think it's important to hold up, if you're going to talk about saints or martyrs, I mean, to hold up examples of people who've stood for principles that do matter in an ethical way. And I think for him, it did come out of a religious core. He really, I think, felt that I got to do this. God's going to judge me. I got to really, even if that means my life is on the line. And I think whatever his faults, I think there's a real courage and admirable heroism and that kind of commitment.
I'd have to say that's one of the things I respected most about him, because I was trying to put myself in his shoes. Like, if I'm trying to lead my country towards progress, and I know the opposition who's running this campaign against me is just dirty, but
Right.
they win. And, I'm in power. I have the opportunity to shut them down or try and keep the peace.
Right.
And he did what he preached.
Right.
That's I think a hard pill to swallow, losing any election like that, but to just put your country before yourself, that's
right. No, I agree. Yeah, and actually, not to have a shameless plug here, but I have a second book coming out.
we love shameless plugs.
It's the end of the podcast, so it's like time for shameless plugs, But
yeah,
with it, I've actually co-authored with a great scholar named John Earl, who teaches at a school called Center College in Kentucky, and John's just a great scholar of Uganda. But it's called Contesting Catholics: Benedicto Kiwanuka and the Birth of Postcolonial Uganda. And it's a little more of an academic monograph, you could say, much more, even more deeply historical, but it really goes into more depth on Kiwanuka and his political party and the way in which they were literally contesting with all of the other different political movements around the time of independence. And that book's coming out in April with James Curry, which is a big African studies press. So in any case, if you want more,
we'll have you back. April.
We'll have you back. Yeah, exactly.
We got more. No.
I heard COVID's gonna be done by Easter, so we should be
That's
good.
Right. Yeah. It was supposed to be done by last Easter, right? But
no, that's what fake news media.
Yeah, right. No,
said,
yeah, I mean, God, yeah. I guess in all honesty, I mean, the disease is just really taking its toll, and particularly here in the States. And yeah, so you really do hope for progress with the vaccine and just people's behavior too, because there's no need for in my country here. I mean, over 1,000 people are dying a day. There's just no need for that. So.
Yeah, here in Chicago, we start our lockdown and curfew on Monday now.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't been to bars in months, so it's okay.
Oh.
That's all I went out for. That and work.
I don't want to take this wrong. I do miss the bars.
Oh,
that's where I get all my best theological material. I mean, that's where. So, yeah, I mean, they're obviously. I mean, these are quote unquote minor sacrifices, but yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, I think everybody hopes for a return to some kind of normalcy down the road.
Well, just a quick side note about Kiwanuka. It was interesting to hear that he's been the only person to let go of his power since the inception of the Ugandan government.
Right.
So
the transfer of power is one of the most important things in any democracy. It's so yeah. We don't want to take it for granted. Let's hope it peacefully happens in this country within the next 2 months. So.
Yeah, talk about good timing.
Yeah. Right.
So I guess the last question we could ask is maybe more of a general question, and I guess writing this book and with all of your experience in Uganda, like what are the couple of the biggest things that you learned, and maybe what are some of the biggest things you learned about like the power of Catholic social teaching?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So, yeah, I think for me, I learned like the value of talking to people, which I know sounds obvious, but the first book I wrote on Rwanda, again, I think is a good book. It made a real contribution, but I was largely working in archives, and there was real value in that. But I think this book on Uganda, I was really talking to people I think the opening line in the book, it's, this priest says to me, the information is not in the archives, it's in our heads. And so, and so I think the value of oral history and the need to really go to people, and particularly often elders and those who have really kept the memories of the community. And I think particularly from a kind of decolonizing point of view, that's, I think, especially important, because often written resources are controlled by Westerners, and colonial records reflect their own kind of, colonial biases. And so to actually go to two people, in the context, particularly speaking as a white outsider, it was probably a real big lesson. And then I think related to that with Catholic social thought, I think for me, again, my book on Rwanda is it's not easy reading, and anything about what happened with the genocide there is very difficult. And the church's complicity in many cases with what happened. But so in honesty, I was sort of looking for, okay, is there alternatives to just this very, very negative trajectory? And I think for me, it was also inspiring to see within a very difficult social and political context, and the inevitability of human sin, that you have people who I think really do stand out as these exemplars, and really can teach us a lot about what it means in our own ways to try to move the needle a little bit, or as Mother Teresa used to say, to light a candle, do something to kind of move things forward. I mean, not all of us are gonna, be the Mother Teresa of Uganda or whatever, but I think it's a call to it, because I do think there's always a temptation of like giving in to, what the Jesuits would call desolation, or giving in to cynicism, and like, oh, everything sucks, and everything's just, and particularly in 2020 with everything going on. But that's not really the right takeaway, right? I mean, things are probably going to suck, but if anything, even more, one should be moving, right? I mean, the more it sucks, the more you should be.
I couldn't agree more.
Right, and
if you're comfortable, that's when you stop.
Right. So I think, in my mind, seeing the long-term way in which, like, we didn't talk a lot about her, but someone like Rosalba Oywa, peace activist, they 30 years of working on these questions in the midst of war and reconstruction, and being hounded by the government, having death threats, and just staying with it, right? And not, like, as one of her colleagues said, just the politics of endurance. And I think that to me was also a takeaway, and even for me, challenged me to think, like, okay, you can't move the needle everywhere, but here in Omaha, or as a teacher, other things, what can you do? Because I think, again, global media can almost overextend us. And I think for me, these people call me back also to the local, and what do you know? What can you actually do? Because it takes time. I mean, like Father Tonino said, it takes 5 years just to get to know a place. It takes 10 years to make any change. It takes 30 years to actually sustain it. So I think that to me is also an important takeaway, and so not always to think about huge, big impact, or how many followers you have, or making a big splash, but like, how are you really moving things on the ground? And for me, particularly Rosalba was just such a model of that. She should be better known, and I hope this book will help with that. But she doesn't care. It's like I don't care if I'm getting a bunch of international awards. Like, my job is to kind of move the situation locally, and she's done tremendous work in that regard.
Well, Dr. Carney, we know you've got a busy schedule with lots of students, but thank you so much for joining us for this podcast. I know our listeners will put a link to your book, and I think people will be really, really interested. It's a really, really good read, and a quick read.
Yeah.
And there's I know it's very specific to Uganda, but the way that you wrote it, there's just so many things that you can take away from in your own life about how you work, and big or small, and kind of like reflecting on your own self.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you. And could you all share a link with me?
It was really well written. So shout out to you for that.
No, I was just saying, would you mind sharing a link with me to the podcast whenever it's available? And
Sure.
We'll do it. Yeah.
I can listen to it, and I can share it with folks I know, and share it on Facebook or whatever. So
yeah, absolutely. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah.
We'd love to have you back on one of your other books.
Yeah,
sometime.
sure. No, or we can just chat.
Like, all about
We could start a new religion and politics podcast. You know, that'll be hot.
Oh, you don't want.
I don't know. I don't know, Dr. Carney.
That's right. So, but
I
yeah,
want you to keep your job.
yeah. I need to go to another meeting here, but it's great being with you all. And all right, well, God bless you guys, and great being with you. So
Nice meeting you today. Hopefully, we'll see you soon for another episode.
sounds good. And you in Luganda, Welaba. Goodbye.
Welaba.
What's going on in Swahili?